Tuesday. The sun would rise once again on the most typical morning of the most typical day of the week in the 21st century. The day was just getting started in the east, while those on the California West Coast were still busy sleeping the previous night away. "It's too quiet today," said a TV weatherman. Whether it was cooking breakfast, getting the paper, or mowing the lawn, people went about their routines with great contentment and autonomy. For some, that included starting the day browsing the World Wide Web. What a perfect day to be normal. But in just about 15 minutes, American history, world history, and the trajectory of the new millennium would change forever.
I have got to interrupt you right now.
Sorry.
We're going to go live right now and show you a picture of the World Trade Center.
September 11th, 2001. You will remember this day as long as you live. The killers will pay for this attack on America.
The World Trade Center, the quintessential icon of the American dream, was now gone, which for many was eerily symbolic for where the country's frame of mind was now heading. This unparalleled attack on the United States was felt everywhere: the living room, classrooms, hardware stores, the internet. 9/11 was something the world had never seen, and the extremely odd behavior and state of the World Wide Web at the time and after certainly reflected that. News of the towers, the Pentagon, the White House was reaching the world at unmatched, dangerous speeds compared to the similarly scaled global events which preceded it. Consequently, for many people, access to the internet altogether completely halted. Anecdotal reports from users claim that websites like Yahoo, CNN, and MSNBC experienced intense bottlenecking from the unfathomable amounts of traffic at that time. Naturally, people had no other choice but to stay glued to the TV. This is not going to be a video on how 9/11 happened, but instead we'll focus on its after effects. Because regardless of whether you remember it or not, the changes that came from 9/11 are still felt, studied, and observed in so many facets of everyday life, and that especially includes the world online. It didn't just highlight the true limitations of the internet at the time, it changed how we use the internet, both technologically and culturally. But what does that entail? The cultural shift is without question. In many respects, 9/11 was the end of the 90s in terms of attitude and spirit, and this was expressed through an almost sudden awareness of the web's infrastructure and how we use it to measure, quantify, and communicate data.
Police believe he is in that vehicle.
This new extension of mass media further created an unfortunate consequence. More incentive to spread news that isn't telling the full story and often motivated by self-interest, while still creating the illusion of the pursuit of truth. Ground News helps solve this very real problem. It is an app and website that aggregates the world's news outlets and shows important context based on the source of the information. It is especially important with a subject such as 9/11 to be getting information that is both as accurate as possible and presented in good faith. It allows us to maintain our ability to think critically, even in times of crisis. The blind spot feed allows you to see these things from all angles. The internet is full of so much conflicting information, so Ground News provides a methodical approach to digesting that information responsibly. Go to ground.news/squid to get 40% off the unlimited access Vantage plan that I use. Supporting Ground News not only supports my work, it supports the exchange of ideas and the ability to think for yourself and not others. Ground News. See the world as it really is. In 2001, the internet was still new. There wasn't really an online stare decisis, a list of examples of what to do and what not to do when browsing the net. So people just did what made sense at the time. For example, if you logged on to a website, it would just send whatever amount of data it needed to in order to display that page the way it was intended, within the range of DSL bandwidth, of course. Web hosts and internet service providers back then were always measuring online traffic relative to their bandwidth to roughly see how many people they can serve at once with ease. Luckily, with standard internet traffic, this really wasn't much of an issue. But what if you have thousands, maybe millions of computers, all on one website at the same time? You probably see the problem. This was just a scenario that people didn't really put much thought into. So during the early hours of Tuesday, September 11th, 2001, all systems were operational as expected. Providers like AOL and Verizon typically scheduled routine maintenance at this time, since it was when they had the least amount of activity. But when American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, user traffic, driven by people trying to learn the absolute latest information, increased by orders of magnitude within just a few minutes, and these servers just couldn't handle it. Much of the internet simply stopped working. One user reported being at school trying to log on to CNN and Yahoo.com to get more information, and they just couldn't. It was an event where the Earth stood still. Now, when we look back at this retrospectively and with our understanding of Y2K internet infrastructure, this cause and effect scenario makes perfect sense. What's happening here is quite simple. When you have a website that is experiencing so much online traffic at once, much more than what is considered normal, there are then two scenarios that typically occur. The first scenario, which was much more common in 2001, was that the flooding of the traffic was quite literally too much bandwidth for these websites to handle. Imagine the online equivalent of pinching a fire hose and trying to turn it on. The amount of power and energy is simply too great for that amount of space, so flow gets interrupted and often stops entirely. It is quite literally why they call it a bottleneck. The second scenario is that the website will voluntarily shut off their servers when they detect that there is about to be more traffic than they can handle. This saves them from having any bandwidth wasted. This is typically a mechanism present in websites with better security. This is what made DDoS attacks so effective in 2001 compared to today. With enough computing power, you could effectively shut down any website, especially with most internet still being dial-up at the time. Short for distributed denial of service, it is basically when the perpetrator sends so many requests to a server, it causes this bottleneck to occur. To save time for the perpetrator and to make it quicker, these requests are basically multiple copies of the exact same thing. While there weren't exactly a ton of safeguards for preventing DDoS attacks in 2001, just based on this information alone, they were quite easy to detect, because when a website is just popular, the people navigating it are typically searching and requesting for all kinds of things rather than just one. But how do you spot the difference between a DDoS attack and millions of people living through a major historical event? Well, in 2001, you pretty much couldn't. So when these servers are suddenly flooded with insane amounts of traffic searching for the same thing like World Trade Center, Twin Towers, or even people just visiting the homepage of a website, it really doesn't look all that different from your traditional DDoS attack. In fact, the FBI even assumed that much of this was just another form of terrorism, but this time being a cyber attack rather than a physical one, as their website also experienced performance issues when they posted the mugshots of the plane hijackers. And given that it's been over 20 years, there's really no way to know for sure just how much of it was intentional. Either way, the problem only worsened as events unfolded. When United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower just around 9:03 a.m., MSNBC, New York Times, Yahoo, and CNN all experienced severely halted performance. Many people couldn't even get online at all. For some, these technical interruptions were literal, directly related to the attacks. Following the collapse of the North and South Towers and then Building 7, a nearby Verizon office and other wireless providers were severely damaged. This did affect much of the online infrastructure in New York City, and according to nationalacademies.org, even as far as Europe. And it's during all of this where you start to see these websites innovate, start to get creative on how they can still send and receive data and communicate to the people in the midst of an emergency. CNN's approach to sending information at that time was sufficient for standard internet traffic, but with an event of this magnitude, there were problems. They decided in real time to figure out a way to decrease the amount of bandwidth used without compromising the amount of information they wanted to broadcast. So they created an algorithm that allowed them to effectively compress the content on the page and make it as minimalist as possible. The same information with much less power. It wasn't perfect, but it significantly subsided these issues. Other companies did anticipate that these issues would happen and sort of embraced it. MSNBC, for example, streamed its live cable feed to their website. which wasn't exactly the most common thing in 2001. They even hired a company called Akamai to monitor this usage of data. When you consider this, it's no surprise that MSNBC ran into problems. But the decision alone was quite innovative. In a sort of grim way, 9/11 taught us a lot about compression and enhancing online communication while still potentially saving tons of bandwidth, something especially important during a time of crisis. This approach taken by CNN is a somewhat primitive example of the web caching technologies that we take for granted today. In retrospect, these practices that were implemented as a result of 9/11 and our understanding of the internet since then seems incredibly obvious. It's actually kind of hard to believe that it took until 2001 to make these changes that just feel like common sense now. Well, in many ways, 9/11 was essentially the first major online historical event. That's not to say that past events got bleak internet coverage, but there was a culture at the time that simply focused on other mediums for gaining information while the internet was still in its infancy. The nature of the event itself also played a big role. Columbine was mostly observed through television, and to a lesser extent, newspapers. The internet was more of a secondary means of getting information. This was also the case with the death of Princess Diana, which happened almost 2 years prior. Not only was the internet smaller back then compared to 2001, these events were also viewed and reacted to differently, which again does influence the medium from which they're observed. Columbine was viewed by average Americans as a tragic story from a small town in the middle of Colorado. Princess Diana's death was viewed in a more parasocial manner, as a tragic event about a celebrity in another country. Make no mistake, as devastating as these stories are, there is somewhat a degree of separation in terms of relatability, because we often associate these events with things happening far away from us, with people we don't know, leaving only the television to tell us the story. 9/11 felt much more personal. Not only did it affect so much more people, but the intentions behind it stung way harder for the everyday person. The Twin Towers were some of the most recognizable buildings in America, the world even. They represented freedom and the pursuit of happiness, and they were taken away. Naturally, its impact was so much larger, and so it was observed in nearly every possible way, and that especially includes the internet, because it was the biggest it had ever been at that point. It makes sense that frantic people would go online to try and get as much information as quickly as possible, because that's what the internet is for. And it effectively took a big event like 9/11 for people to understand its true limitations and imperfections. So how do we prevent internet outages from occurring whenever a big historical event happens? Well, you pretty much can't. Actually, 9/11 wasn't even one of the big ones. The greatest internet outage to ever occur due to traffic was in 2009 after the death of Michael Jackson. I did an entire video on this as well if you would like to check that out. It was so big, in fact, this phenomenon has specifically been called the Michael Jackson effect. It happened again with the death of Prince and Queen Elizabeth. 9/11 was kind of the first in this regard and essentially taught us the fundamentals of internet behavior. These technological changes were accompanied by cultural ones too, many of which were very controversial. It included small things like banning certain songs from the radio that had lyrics that could be associated with the attacks, or removing World Trade Center imagery from movies and television. Of course, these changes creeped into the internet. The Patriot Act effectively allowed for mass surveillance of people's online activity in order to combat terrorism, something many Americans found unconstitutional. For many years to come, it would create a persistent debate within the country about the true value of privacy. Lastly, with 9/11 came the great consequence of misinformation. Before the luxury of the World Wide Web, news was dependent on credentialed, experienced journalists. But the internet was starting to give everyone basically equal opportunity to share their takes on these subjects, many of whom would be misinformed. I went to my mom's house recently, and I was going through a big box of old family photos, and I found pictures of me at my aunt and uncle's house, and there was a little date in the corner. These photos were taken just a couple of weeks before 9/11. And I am not old. It just really put in perspective just how recent all of this was. And that's really something we probably don't think about that much. It's human to not think about it, because I think we often prefer to associate major historical events with things that happened a long time ago. The Titanic, World War II. It's almost more comforting in that way, because we then don't have to confront it head on. But the legacy of 9/11 is still here. It's part of our everyday life, our customs, the way we participate in society, and the internet. The thing that has essentially become the main character of our lives is only part of it. It's easy to forget that, but we must make sure that we don't.